Gore Vidal is America's greatest living man of letters. For 50 years, his novels, essays, stage and screenplays have delighted and shocked his public, while his political views have never been less than radical.
It's just fresh.
He's the wittiest of all American writers. Most of us aren't witty at all. He has a rather prickly personality, you know. How popular do you expect a porcupine to be?
Taking pictures here.
I'm still trying to look natural.
He was beautiful. I mean, people flirted with him, male and female. His sexuality was such that it was there for all.
I follow him in the press. I follow him as a politician. I follow him as a friend. He is one of the players in American politics and has been over the last 30 years and more.
There is something about this facade, this impenetrable wit and intelligence that doesn't easily lend itself to an image of a man, you know, suffering little children onto his lap, but in his own way, he's very sweet.
I would cast him as a psychopathic killer.
Gore, are you enjoying writing your memoir?
Well, I don't know if enjoy is quite the verb. It's rather significant in the life of anybody, I suppose. When you get to the memoir, you know the life is just about done with. It's the sort of thing you put off till last. Sort of thing I thought I'd put off for good. You can only tell the truth about the people that you've known in fiction. That's why we invented fiction. There are a lot of problems to writing a memoir. I think it might be better just to call it a tissue of lies and make it all up, with its central character being an invented character like myself. Many things interest me, but I don't seem to have caught my own attention over the years. And I feel I'm writing about a stranger when I reconstruct my life. I found one thing interesting. I must ask some other memoirists about this. There's not one moment that I would like to relive. And it's been quite a contented life, perhaps too contented. But I find that odd because almost everybody said, oh, that summer and Lake Annecy was the high point of my life, et cetera, et cetera. There's been none of that.
But is that, there's no sort of great love affair in your life which has prompted you, or?
Well, there was one very early, and one was early enough. I don't think it happens twice. There are some people who I think are partial to the notion, particularly kids, of having a twin. And all that I was not, he was, and all that he was not, I was, and the two of us would have been pretty good had we been rolled into one. He was killed 50 years ago, March 1st, at Iwo Jima. And so doing the memoirs, I was somewhat haunted by him. And I was intrigued by another self that didn't survive. I was very interested in sex. I was not interested in love affairs. And I'm not going to be able to write an agony story. But I might find a few jokes along the way.
Is that because there really wasn't any agony?
Well, if there was, I'm a Stoic, or so I like to think, and so I was brought up. When you're brought up by a blind man who was accidentally blinded by the age of 10 and made his way in the world, self-pity is very hard to indulge in when you live with somebody like that. I was brought up in the house of my grandfather, Senator T.P. Gore.
Friend, to obtain votes with false promises is worse than to obtain money with false pretense.
My grandfather was an extraordinary influence on me. He sort of taught me to read, got me interested in history, Got me interested in literature, certainly got me interested in politics, certainly got me interested in the politics of the people. He was an old populist. And what is considered my left-wing positions are nothing but the positions of the party of the people.
That I will never rob your cradles to feed the dogs of war.
I was brought up in Washington. It was a nice place to grow up in, but it was, after all, it was a small southern town. I think there were about 300,000 people. Everybody knew everybody else. The race war was not as intense as it now is. It was a company town. Politics was the only subject that anybody ever talked about. But really, the only thing attractive to me in the city is the White House. It's the only game in town. I would put up with Washington if one could live there. But driving around, I am struck over and over again. This is a city of the dead. Everywhere you look, there's a memorial to somebody who's been shot. It's a very creepy city to me now, and I must say I don't really care to go back. After my birth, my father, my mother, and I moved to Rock Creek Park, the house of Senator Gore, her father, and is now the residence of the Malaysian ambassador. And his wife, very charming woman.
I was placed in a drawer.
Here we lived, off and on, for the first 10 years of my life. And as living with the in-laws is a sure route to divorce. In due course, my parents did divorce, but I was very, very happy with my proper parents, my grandfather and my grandmother.
I was prematurely taught to read by my grandmother so that she would be able to do other things than read to him. He was blind from the age of 10, and so he was always read to all day long. So I learned to read at 5 and 6, and I was really reading grown-up books to him at 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
Did you like to read to your grandfather?
Oh, yes. He was very interesting, very witty man, and he would explain enough of the text so I knew what was happening. I read a lot of history to him. I was bored by the congressional record, you know, that kind of stuff. On the other hand, by the age of 10, I understood bimetallism, which I don't think any 10-year-old has ever understood, and the meaning of fiat money. So, because he was on the Banking and Currency Committee. In his day, the entire top of the house was one long, raw room with just plain deal wood floors and 20,000 books. And I was constantly reading, and I would sit in, these windows are set in rather funny embrasures, which would just fit a seated child. And I would sit there and read, removed from the house and removed from the world. I began to suspect that a writer had been born when I first read a book just to myself, not aloud. And as I began to read it, I started to think of an alternative work to the one I was reading. I was all of 7 then. The book was called The Duck and the Kangaroo, a tale of unnatural affection. So I began to write my own version of this while I was reading it. And by the time I was 14, I think I'd started about 3 novels. And Willowa, my first published novel, written when I was 19, must have been about my 7th attempt. So, you know, one was a novelist. And I had the good, or I think perhaps bad fortune of being published very early, before I was ripe enough. Tennessee Williams always said, "It's a pity, Gore, that you became so successful so young. You always got to see the world from a successful person's perspective." Tennessee was extremely hard on other people's characters. I often felt that about him, too. But there was something in it, perhaps, that I was recording life at a point before I really quite understood what I was recording. And then, rather naturally, thanks to my childhood in this room, in this house, history and politics were, the air I breathed, the way my brain worked. So it was inevitable that I would go in those directions. I used to bring my grandfather down there when I was 8.
He brought you down.
No, he was blind. Yeah. And I came on the floor on a hot summer day in a bathing suit. In those days, in a bathing suit, nothing else. No. Barefoot, because in those days you took off your shoes in June, didn't put them on until September. And I remember then we went onto the floor, and I sat down beside him. Mm-hmm. Everything's very relaxed, and suddenly the vice president, Mr. John Nance Garner,
Cactus Jack,
Cactus Jack came down and said, Senator, that boy is naked. And my grandfather, who had been holding my arm like that as I walked along, I had short sleeves, he thought I was listening. So his arm went a little further down, and he sprinted out of there, blind as he was.
The history of this table is called the treaty table.
Well, it was always pretty clear to me that I was going to be a writer, whether I liked it or not. And I'm not so sure I did like it all that much, as I wanted to be a politician, like my grandfather. But I've quickly figured out that the writer has just one job, which is to tell the truth as he understands it, whereas the politician has only one thing in view, and that is never to give the game away. So the two things are in opposition.
Do you think without your grandfather, you'd have written the historical novels and the classical ones?
Can't tell. I don't know how else I would have been brought up, but certainly it made them easy for me. It made them inevitable, because between him and me, our lives span, I think it's over half or 2/3 of the life of the Republic. And he remembers his grandfather, who was in the Revolution. So this is a straight line to the beginning. So to me, the American history was always a family affair. That's why I chose to, in those novels like Burr and Washington, D.C., to tell it through the eyes of one family, as indeed one family might have experienced it all. Had it not been for him and the fact that I was exposed to politicians and the floor of the Senate and all these books, who knows, I might have been a really serious and important novelist who would write about the only important subject, which is marriage. I was very close to my father. He had a charming and serene disposition. He was a very droll man. And he was an inventor. He was a true artist.
Found out whether or not a 10-year-old youngster could handle it. What do you think?
Sure, I'll try it.
My father was eager to find a popular plane, a cheap plane. In fact, I think he dreamed of being the Henry Ford of aviation. So he was forever coming up with prototypes of cheap airplanes that were absolutely safe, so safe that even I, at the age of 10, could fly it. He was rather mean. So was the senator. But one of the reasons they were so fond of me was at the age of 17, I enlisted in the Army, so the government paid for me. By the time I got out of the Army, when I was 19, I'd already written my first book. From then on, my father and I never agreed about anything, particularly politically. He was very right-wing. And yet, in 43 years that I knew him, we never quarreled. Nor did I with Senator Gorham. Though he was far too awesome to quarrel with. But on the other hand, my mother was a virago. And the only way I can handle her in the memoirs, and I think it's going to work, is as a character of great comedy. I mean, here, she's a real honest-to-God lush, 1920s flapper. Let's face it, I'm the guy who gives a shirt off his back. She loves the sort of butch talk, as though she were a man. I'm the guy, this. And she has always done so much for others, and others have always let her down. Well, the more I keep doing the dialogue, because it starts to come back to me, I am in stitches. I mean, she is so funny, inadvertently.
On the other hand, I used to think, how on earth did I get stuck with this as a mother? You know, that was a bit of bad luck. You might say I had a moment of self-pity in my early adolescence, but I soon got over it. And then I solved it by refusing to see her the last 20 years of her life. It was a great burden off my back. In 1935, my father and mother were divorced. I arrived here in November 1935. My mother had just married Hugh de Auchincloss, who had just remodeled what was then a fairly new house. I can remember the smell of the raw paint and the wet plaster. Everybody had a headache. The dining room is the same size and shape that it was. I remember my stepfather, Hugh Auchincloss, was a great fisherman, and over the fireplace he had an enormous marlin that he had caught, this hideous fish with, you know, a long sword on it. And the quarrels that went on for 8 years between him and my mother over that fish to get that damn thing off the wall. She said, "It spoils dinner," but he wouldn't take it down. The fish is now history. My first memory of the house, we came out at night, and I got up in the morning, as 10-year-olds do, at about 7 o'clock. And I went exploring around the place. I came back in, and what should I find? Sitting right here in this spot was my mother after her wedding night. I never remember what anybody wears, but she was wearing a gray silk dressing gown with a red border, looking rather disconsolate. And she said, "Do you like it here?" And I said, "Well, we just got here. I can't tell." She said, would you like it if I went back to your father?" And I knew that, even at 10, I knew that wasn't going to be possible, because he was far, far away. And I said, "Well, I don't know." Apparently, the wedding night and the marriage proved to be a disaster. However, she stayed married to Auchincloss for 6 years, 7 years, and had 2 children by him, who were, I think, born in this house, certainly brought up on the 3rd floor. But I've often rethought in memory the figure of her on these stairs, wondering what to do, and already wondering how to get out. That was my bedroom for about 6 years when I lived here. After I moved out, my mother divorced Mr. Auchincloss, and then he married a lady who had 2 daughters, one called Jackie, one called Lee. And then that Jackie moved into my room, found some of my old shirts, which she said she used to wear when she went riding. Then she married Jack Kennedy, and they came back after their honeymoon, and they stayed in that room. We would show it to you, but unfortunately it's now a closet. It's odd what you dream about. Most people have the same experience I do, that you dream about places that you grew up in. I dream of this river. I have a recurring dream that I am running at great speed through these woods, over the rocks, down to the river at the bottom, where we're always told not to swim. It's very dangerous, so we always swam there. And the scene between Bob Ford and Jim Willard in The City and the Pillar took place right down there. Abruptly, Bob pulled away. For a bold moment, their eyes met. Then, deliberately, gravely, Bob shut his eyes, and Jim touched him, as he had so many times in dreams, without words, without thought, without fear. When the eyes are shut, the true world begins. As faces touched, Bob gave a shuddering sigh and gripped Jim tightly in his arms. Now they were complete.
Each became the other as their bodies collided with a primal violence, like to like, metal to magnet, half to half, and the whole restored.
This is about the only thing left of the ill-named Merrywood that is still the same. This is the pool house, and there used to be a swimming pool here, which it seems to have gone away. I'm not particularly autobiographical as a writer, but when I came to write Washington, D.C., I used houses that I had grown up in. I used Merrywood, which we've just seen in its current version, and also the house of my grandfather in Rock Creek Park. The pool house is emblematic to me of the book, and maybe of my life. It begins with an adulterous affair on the floor. That's his, that's hers, the dressing room. In the summer of 1937, and they're celebrating at Merrywood up there, a big party to celebrate the defeat of Franklin Roosevelt in the Senate. They're all very right-wing here. My own clans, the Vidals and the Gores, I was brought up by the Gores, so I'm closer to them. I know them better. Once a year, the Gores have a meeting, usually in Mississippi. They govern practically 5 southern states. One of the cousins is currently vice president. And the Kays, my grandmother's family, they're in South Carolina. Once a year, they have a reunion. And hundreds of people come. And we have a president there, an ex-president, Jimmy Carter. And these are support systems. In the absence of a republic, in the absence of governance, all we have is family.
God's family.
I'm Joy Gore, and I'm Mary Jane's sister, and my father is John Gore also. I live in Clinton, Mississippi now, and I'm a computer specialist with the Veterans Administration.
To a meeting in the air, Jubilee, Jubilee. All the saints of all the ages in their glory will be there. Oh, I'm going to that happy Jubilee.
I'm always asked every few minutes what I think, and I had not expected so much musical talent. In a family whose line, my line, T.P. Gore, we are all of us tone deaf. I'm also kind of thrilled today to see so many variations of my nose here. I had sort of thought it was all mine, and now I see that it's only on loan. And that you will see to it that it keeps on going in various variations down the ages. My grandfather came back here, some of you may remember, certainly you heard tell of, in 1910. I remembered some of his sayings and his statesmanship. Anyway, he once said, if there was any race but the human race, I would go join it. He had a dark side to him, but I think today he would be properly pleased with the human race as of this warm afternoon.
I saw T.P. I was a grown girl, the last trip that I remember that he made back here. Mm-hmm. And he was just as sweet and good as he was then.
Yeah.
But we all loved T.P.
Well, he was a very funny man, I must say.
He was a good man. You knew how he became blind, didn't you?
Well, you tell me. I know a story, but how was the first time is the one I'm vague about.
Slingshot.
A slingshot. He told me about throwing nails at a cow when he was about 8. Then he said he was down in Jackson as a page to a state senator, and he bought a boy a birthday present of a gun that you pull the trigger and a spike would come out. Didn't go off.
held it up to his eye, it went off, and he said, "I am blind," like that.
Do we have many Gores other than Al?
Young Al,
Young Al.
not on the national scene, no.
I liked him.
Albert, I liked Albert Sr. Jr. I'm not so keen about.
The populist movement to which he and the whole Gore clan belonged was rebellion against the banks and against what they call the Bourbons, which were the old guard Democrats and the great planter families. It's curious that when he married my grandmother, he married into a planter family, proving, as the English anthropologist Geoffrey Gore once said, all great men early in life commit hypergamy. I do not need to translate the Greek, which means marrying somebody above your social station. And I think T.P. Gore did that, and my father did that by marrying T.P. Gore's daughter. And the long line of hypergamists ends in me. Eudora, you as a watcher of people, one question that sort of passed through my mind, that my grandfather, Senator Gore, was what they call a free thinker. And suddenly I'm surrounded by 200 relatives who really believe in our Lord. And up in that area, I mean, at every crossroads, there is a church, Baptist church, Methodist church. And this seemed to be, because I asked a couple, these are doctors, lawyers, these are not what they sometimes condescendingly call simple folk. They're very complicated and well-educated people. And this thing was the center of their lives. And I just wondered, you as one who has lived here all your life, is this something new? Did it start with the TV evangelicals and Billy Graham? Has this been consistent?
I think it's been consistent.
Yeah.
I think it's just part of life here, especially in small towns. It's the center of activity and so on. I had a visitor from New York one time who said, "I've just come through Midtown in Jackson and something must be the matter. I saw all these streams of people pouring into the churches." And I said, "Well, it's Sunday. That's all that's happened." I think it is part of the way of life. I don't think it's new. But maybe it was the occasion, you know, everybody getting together.
And from all over.
And sort of establishing contacts and getting the connections.
But we had 8 hymns at the beginning.
That's a lot.
That's a lot. Luckily, only one chorus of each. But one thing I think, in fact, 'cause I have never seen the state of Mississippi before, and it was as green, I'm talking about Chickasaw County and all, as I expected. But I did recognize some of the same. There was the Kentucky Fried Chicken stand, and there was McDonald's. Yeah. Have you noticed that there's been more homogenization?
Yeah, but I was thinking in a deeper sense maybe because in those early days when nobody much left where they grew up, they really had certain aspects of character that you could identify with them. Like everybody said, "Oh, those girls from the Delta, they're so fast." You know, those girls you can always tell a girl from the coast, you know, the high heels they wear and so on. So we were forced to wear a uniform so that we couldn't see differences. Well, all those things are now gone. So that you really can't tell the Delta from anywhere else.
Upstate, yeah.
This production is brought to you by your Pontiac dealer, who sells and services Pontiac, a General Motors masterpiece.
I first met Eudora Welty in 1946 when my first book was published. Then came The City and the Pillar and the New York Times reviewer. Mr. Prescott hated it, and I was blacked out. My next 5 books. What to do? I was desperate. And I was saved because I had to make a living, and I was desperate. Something new had happened called television, live television, and I plunged in.
Tonight's play, A Sense of Justice by Gore Vidal.
For a long time.
Wonderful. Welcome home.
See you. 1954, I went into live television, and I started in 54, and I ended in
41. So I spanned most of the career of live television. And it was very exciting. It was like a club. What excited me, and it's the only thing that's ever excited me in my life artistically, and I mean the adverb without any ironic gloss, I was doing something that a country wanted.
The one person who killed a man he didn't know just out of a sense of justice.
In a sense of justice, I was trying to show at the height of the Joe McCarthy period that someone, an individual, might, out of a sense of justice, act in a way that the society as a whole dared not act when somebody like Hitler comes along, or in the case of Joe McCarthy, or in the case of my play, The Boss of a State, who was showing definite totalitarian symptoms.
For the evening.
It was a very dangerous play to write.
Stay alive, son. Takes a lot more nerve.
All of the actors, the directors, the producers, we'd come here after the show, which would be broadcast live at about, I don't know, 9 o'clock. We'd come out here by 10 or 10:30. All of us wrecked. Everybody became an alcoholic. I'm one of the few that managed to live this long. But I realized I was the last guest. I am Rip Van Wittich. Come back from the past. And it's all half a century ago. I was a very unsuccessful child. I was no good at being a child. I was a young man forever. And I rather thought that was my role. I skipped middle age, and I think I'm now going into old age. And as somebody old who still has suddenly a nervous laugh, eyes begin to dart about, still some of his marbles. I may enjoy old age.
These little town blues are melting away. I'll make a brand new start of it in old New York, if I can make it there, I'll make it anywhere. It's up to you, New York, New York.
You don't get that very often, I think, on documentary television.
It's fantastic, Howie.
That's a real voice.
It's the craziest thing I've ever done in my life. You want me to get undressed now?
No, it's a great voice, and it's very applicable to what we're doing. We're doing New York, a city I don't like and he likes.
I love it.
When you met Gore, Harry, were you living in New York?
Yeah, I was living here. And I was working for Lever Brothers. Dreary.
And you were a college graduate, which I was not.
Yeah.
He'd put himself through college, and I never went to college. And I think that's 43 years ago when we first met. That drew me to him. He was a college graduate. I was not.
The first question I think I asked Gore was, what is your definition of an intellectual? And he said, anybody who understands an abstract. And that kind of cleared things up for me for some reason. I don't know.
Anyway, we're driving down Fifth Avenue. I'm trying to give you a little color about my life, and my life doesn't have any color at all. In fact, I've forgotten practically everything I ever did. Thank God.
Are we here?
suppose Los Angeles is my favorite American city, but this city isn't here, which is what I like about it. You make any kind of life you want. Nothing imposes itself upon you, except probably the smog and the odd earthquake, but by and large, you make your own world here. I think for somebody who's in the business of creating worlds, it's a rather good thing. I came out here for the work in the 50s. So I had to make a living, and writing for television and writing movies. It was a trade, which many novelists of my generation and the generation before me, like Faulkner and Fitzgerald, Isherwood, Huxley. I was also spoiled because I came out of live television where the writer was #1. You watched a Paddy Chayefsky play, or a play by me, or Reginald Rose. You didn't watch a play by Frank Schaffner, the director. And we had a saying at MGM that the power man, the commander of the movie, was the producer. The pretty man was the star. The creative man was the writer. And the director was the brother-in-law, usually of some high-ranking official at the studio, because nobody wanted to spend 8 hours or whatever a day on a soundstage with a bunch of actors. Then the French, in their confusion in the 1950s, decided that all these act directors were suddenly auteurs, creators. And the town shook with laughter as the word spread that we are artists. And these old makers of westerns and so on, I actually brushed up, tried to learn a little French. The writers were pretty cynical about the directors, and the writers outranked the directors until the 50s. They got paid more generally. John O'Hara came out, I remember, and he was also writing a column saying, I never thought I'd meet Aldous Huxley, Christopher Isherwood, and Gore Vidal on the set of a Western. He was a great snob, John O'Hara. I never thought I'd meet John O'Hara. For opposite reasons.
Was Huxley an influence on you at all?
Yes, he was. I was sort of imaginative novel of ideas, which is what he tried to do. It's pretty much what I have tried to do from time to time. We're in the Malibu colony, where I lived back in the 50s. It was the age of the young Paul Newman and Jimmy Dean, and there was a constant party going on. This is a colony of actors, writers, directors, somewhat sealed off from the rest of the world. Everyone has dogs up and down. And when we lived here, we had a Cocker Spaniel. We had that house, I think it's about the 3rd house from here. Mr. and Mrs. Paul Newman, Howard Austin, and me, and a black Cocker Spaniel.
While Joanne Woodward tends with Paul Newman, her husband.
How did you meet Gore?
Gore wrote a television play called Billy the Kid, which I did with Arthur Penn in the very early days of television, when things were exciting and electric and innovative, and it was quite wonderful. We later did it as a film. And I think the studio changed writers, and Gore has not forgiven me for 40 years for that.
And did you immediately hit it off with them?
Oh yeah, he was he's got a quick and far-ranging mind, and of course I knew mostly as a writer then.
I thought Paul was the most beautiful man I'd ever seen. But when I met Gore, I said, there are 2 of them. He was gorgeous. He was just beautiful. And I loved that he took me seriously. He took me seriously, but he also made fun of me because I was very serious and pretentious as hell. And he didn't allow that. But he also didn't treat me like a dingbat. And he loved the fact that I was Southern, and so was he.
Everything was the weekend. We were all, I was at Metro, Paul at Warner's, Joanne at Fox. One weekend, we counted 100 people who had just arrived. I didn't know. I knew hardly anyone, so I thought they were Paul's friends or Joanne's. They didn't know anyone. And we suddenly were the place to come on Sunday. So there'd be 100 strangers wandering around, and none of us could say, well, get out, for fear it'd be the other person's friend.
We had one long party, and everybody invited everybody. We had the most extraordinary people. Christopher Isherwood was there all the time, and Annie's Neem would come with her beautiful young man. Everybody who was anybody came because of Gore. Because Gore knew, even then, knew everybody.
And then, of course, Paul had not yet married Joanne, so we had Confidential magazine and all sorts of those expose magazines around with telescopes and looking at the house, trying to see what was going on. And it was mostly, you know, who left what in the sink, and why were those towels left in the middle, wet towels in the middle of the bathroom. I'm afraid it was no more glamorous than that.
Were they wild times? Did you feel like you were...
Well, no, they weren't wild times. Actually, although we must have felt as though they were, it was a time... I mean, everybody drank too much, for openers, except for me. I didn't drink at all. So I was the one who was always stealily running around, cleaning up dishes and cleaning up everything and complaining, picking up people's laundry. But it was mainly just groups of people talking all the time. And I think my education really began meeting Gore, because I, through Gore, met people like Christopher and Anise. And
Well, I gave up novel writing for 10 years because I set myself a 10-year plan that in 10 years I would have enough money so I would never have to do anything I didn't want to do again. And at the end of 10 years, I had accomplished that. During the 10-year period, I did 5 plays on Broadway. I did 20 movies, perhaps, about 60 plays for television, doing a lot of essay writing, and I was involved in politics. So toward the end of this period, I had the leisure. I was living up the Hudson River.
So did you see much of Gore and Harry when they moved up to Edgewater?
oh, yes, yes. That was the hangout. It was wonderful.
That relationship, Howard and Gore's, it's sort of monumental in American literary history, and for that period it must have been quite strange or difficult, or maybe it wasn't, I don't know.
Well, I think it was difficult, you know, and there were big problems, and big problems with Gore's mother, and, you know, about Howard, and there were cruel things done, and I always felt, I said, it's wonderful to have, whether this is a romance or not a romance, I don't know, but it is wonderful to find the person in your life who fulfills that which you need. And for Howard and Gore, that is what happened. I remember at one point I did a summer stock play up there at the little theater there, and I stayed at Edgewater for the time that I was in rehearsal. Had a hilarious time. It was wonderful because every morning Gore would go down to write. You know, that's what he does first thing in the morning. So no matter how late or how drunk he was the night before, he was always down in the wonderful octagonal room, sitting in the window with his coffee. And I was always the next person down, and I would come in with my coffee, and then we would sit and talk and in the window looking out at the water. It was a wonderful place to be.
Joanne and I both campaigned for him when he ran for Congress in Dutchess County.
And he didn't win then?
No, but I think he got more votes than Roosevelt did.
Do you think he would have made a good senator, president?
He would have, well, he was running for Congress. Yeah, he would have shaken things up. He's not, you know, Gore does not tremble or quake in the face of opposition. Of course, that's precisely what we need it now, worse than we needed it then.
And I had been a conventional, if somewhat radical, candidate for Congress. In 1960, I was in favor of recognizing Red China, which was a very daring thing to do. I thought the people of the United States ought to be educated, something which was a very radical thought, which is an idea whose time has not yet come. And I doubled the vote in this upstate New York, very conservative district. And I got 20,000 more votes in the district than did Jack Kennedy, who was the head of the ticket. So he was riding on my coattails. But Jack certainly accepted the status quo that the American empire was to be obeyed everywhere, particularly in our backyard.
But given your dislike of the empire, did you try and dissuade him from forays into Southeast Asia?
No, I didn't know a tenth of what I've picked up since. I didn't question the empire, none of us did. And that's why in the 60s it used to get on my nerves. Oh, you knew Jack Kennedy and Harry Truman and you went along with the wars and you actually enlisted in the army in the Second War. And I kept saying, you weren't there, kids. You don't know what kind of a country it was. We thought we were doing our patriotic best. We didn't question the interests of the United States, and we believed the misinformation, disinformation, propaganda that was all about us.
Do you think you would have made a good president or not, or a good senator?
Yes. I don't know about president. Although he and I used to have this dream that he would run for president and he would get elected. And then we would overthrow the government and he would become the emperor and I was going to become sort of the empress and then we could redo the White House. It was glorious, and he was going to rewrite the Constitution, which I think he still has a feeling about.
Do you look back as sort of halcyon days on Edgewater?
Yes, yes. It was halcyon days anyway because we were all at the best and the brightest moment in our lives at that point. We got wonderful and glorious and did other wonderful things, but that was a special moment in time.
And you can see part 2 of Gore Vidal's Gore Vidal at the same time next week.
Specifically Vietnam.
A distaste for Imperial America runs through all your historical novels. Is that what drew you to writing them in the first place?
I first started interested in my own family, and then I got interested in why they were what they were. Then I got interested in the country, why we were what we were. And I started to study the historians with great horror. And I said, well, I better do it. I would love it if somebody else had done it. I certainly would never have bothered. To do a book like Lincoln would take about 4 years of reading, and I would buy books when I went back and go through libraries in New York and in Los Angeles, where I have a house. I don't use a researcher. It's like breaking rocks, too. You have 1 million facts for one of those books, and you have to go over and over and over. Then a man on crutches approached the president and in perfect silence shook his hands. Others came forward, one by one, and each took Lincoln's hand, and to each he murmured something that the man alone could hear. At the end, as Lincoln made his way between the beds, stopping to talk to those who could not move, half of the men were in tears, as was Washburn himself. In the last bed by the door, a young officer turned his back on the president, who touched his shoulder and murmured, "My son, we shall all be the same at the end." Then the president was gone.
I bring in fictional characters as counterpoint to the real ones. So when I'm with the real ones, I keep it as close to what they said and did as I can. And I think one should be pretty meticulous there.
Shad roll, Mr. Lincoln, is an especiality of the Willard.
You know, I have enough on my plate, Mr. Stewart.
Indeed you have, sir. 6 southern states gone from the Union.
Well, they gave us plenty of warning. They said if I was elected, they'd leave the Union. And I was, and they did.
You know, in a way, we are well rid of those cotton republics with their problem of slavery. Our destiny is expansion in Canada, Mexico, the Indies.
With Lincoln, you really had a revolution. He reconceived what was a loosely federated republic with a lot of regional rights into a highly centralized federal republic with a powerful, at one point, I guess, the most powerful army and navy in the world by the time the Civil War was over, with this mystical notion of the Union, which does not exist anywhere except in the psyche of Abraham Lincoln. And then he made it possible for Theodore Roosevelt to make us a great Pacific power by seizing the Philippines.
Do you think you'll carry on from really Washington, D.C. and cover the next? I mean, Kennedy and Camelot would be the next in the series.
Well, the memoir is going to do all that I have to say about Jack Kennedy. And I wouldn't have much good to say about the administration, though. I certainly liked him.
He had a great sense of humor. He was a superb gossip. There was nothing on earth he didn't know. So he was probably the best company of any politician I've ever known, and the least self-important. Jack was restlessly firing away at a target, and Jack said, Tennessee, would you like to try a shot or two at the target? Well, he said, I haven't shot a gun in some time, said Tennessee, and picked it up and made 4 bullseyes in a row. Then at one point, Tennessee was looking at Jack. He said, you know, that boy's got a cute ass. And I said, Tennessee, that's the next president. You can't prove. Oh, he said, he'll never be president. They're much too attractive for the American people. I remember one evening at the White House, Jackie slyly said, oh, why don't we go to the horse show? And Jack groaned. She said, no, we'll just look in. And he groaned and moaned and complained, but he said, all right, we come. What shall I wear? And she then put on this, went out of the room, came back in a bright red dress. He said, no, things are going too bad in Europe. Can't wear red. She went back, she made about 3 changes and ends up in a Chanel suit, I think it is. So we get to the horse show and we end up there almost an hour, and he is squirming and raging and gossiping with me behind her back, and is telling me the entire plot of an Edgar Wallace novel about how a prime minister has been warned that he'll be shot by midnight. Because I'd said, you know, it'd be so easy to shoot you here, they'll probably miss you and hit me. And he said, that's no great loss. He was fun. Might be more interesting to pick up a little later with Johnson. It was a more interesting figure, and take it from Johnson, bring it up to the present. I'm tempted to do that. I have a character in Washington, D.C. who would be my age and would have lasted this long, and would have watched the empire go from its absolute peak in 1945 to fall on its face in Korea in 1950-51, and then just go right off the wall in the Vietnam War. To observe that, but do I want to write such a sad book? I don't know.
So instead you turn to Golgotha.
Well, because that's a happy book with a happy ending. A Japanese ending, which is my tribute to the great empire to the west of us. Oh, I love the inventions. They take my mind off everything, you know. And you start in a world of what could have been, what might be. Timothy, Bishop Timothy, I suppose I should say, Saint Timothy, Tim Boy. I want to level with you. Your gospel is all important to Christianity. On the other hand, creative programming is all important to General Electric and its subsidiary, the network NBC. Now we are getting ready for a big technical breakthrough in software. Any day now, we'll be able to get a camera crew back here, and when we do, we'll be able to tape all sorts of historical events live, as of then anyway, which is where you come in. I chuckle, a noise that I do rather well. Shouldn't I first get a lawyer? Chet gave me a sick smile. I had struck pay dirt. It's a bit too soon to be talking deal, but here's the big plan. We're going to be the first network to go back to Golgotha, where we will shoot the actual crucifixion. Resurrection, the whole ball of wax, live. Now, because viewer identification is the name of the game, that will mean lots of in-depth interviews, not only with the various notables present, but with your average man in the street. Naturally, I don't want to get your hopes up, but for anchor person, you're the front runner.
I'd really like to get into a discussion with Gore. He's been saying absolutely unspeakable things about me. He's been acting even worse than he usually does as a polemicist. You know, he's really, he's shameless in intellectual argument. He's absolutely without character, a moral foundation, or even intellectual substance.
Okay,
I mean, the perfect proof of what he does is that leave it to Gore to write a play about Richard Nixon. You know, I'm getting to the point where I'm going to end up liking Nixon.
I first met Norman Mailer in 1950, and relations were always quite friendly, until I criticized his book, The Prisoner of Sex, because he had taken on, rather harshly, women's liberation. And I attacked his attack on them. And he took it very personally and got very upset. Asked himself on the Cabot program in order to attack me.
We will be, we'll do a message and we'll be right back.
I met Gore back in 1950 or 51. He said, I'm going to outlive you, and I'm going to write the history of our literary time. And implicit in that was Mailer, mind your manners around me for the rest of your time. Gore and I have had our differences. They've been small and famous. But I wouldn't have come here tonight if I couldn't salute him. And I have to tell you that I have had the pleasure of working with a great, if limited, actor. Anyway, wherever you are, Gore, your health, cheers.
I am startled to read how venomous I am, vitriolic, vicious. And I often ask journalists who say this, could you quote something that I said that was vicious? Can you find anything that I said was venomous about somebody? And they can't. I may make a joke. Once again, the words failed Norman Mailer. You know, he threw a glass at me. I don't regard that as venomous. Now we have a great entrance.
Oh, my Lord.
Hello, Gore. How are you?
None of us in his life. To think someday all this will be mine. How are you?
I'm well. And you?
Better for seeing you, as the Irish treacherously say.
You were just in New York, I hear.
I think I was just in New York, yes.
Being a movie star.
Being a movie star, yeah. Oh, God, why didn't you do that? You've
Well,
got the face for it. It's so easy.
You did not see me in Back to School, where I starred with Rodney Dangerfield, and you missed it.
Oh, that was my part. I turned it down. And they
think
got
that's
you.
true.
No, Dangerfield came to me, and I said...
Gore, I'm sorry I came to England.
I said, I draw the line, I said, at frontal nudity. But I said, I think Vonnegut is your man for this. And the next thing I knew, you were playing my part.
This may indeed be the case, because I know I wasn't the first choice, but I didn't know who the others were. I think they asked Mailer before they asked you.
No.
No?
He's the wrong height.
Oh, getting back to Capote again. Did you say what I heard you had said when he died?
Well, I said it, but I said it in private to Jason Epstein, my editor, who had rung me from New York to say that Truman had ridden on ahead and crossed the shining river. Mm-hmm. And I did say, well, that was a good career move.
So you did say it.
I did say it, but I did not say it to the public, and Jason, of course, told everybody, and so I got full credit for having been stony-hearted at the loss of a confrère without price, the greatest jewel, the greatest zircon in the diadem of American literature.
Relief from writing to be able to go out and act in these movies, do the talk shows?
Yes. It's, how to be able to say that writing is a lonely business without saying writing is a lonely business is almost impossible to say, so I will repeat it rapidly. That it is a solitary business, which I quite like. But then there are times when you think, well, what are other people doing? Why shouldn't I be out romping over the greensward with the other lads and lassies? And to make a movie is you get to know a lot of people quite intensely for a rather short time. And that's perfect for me. I have a short attention span. And it's very enjoyable to have 2-3 weeks with a company, and everybody is sort of working toward the same end. And it's collegial. It's nice. Rather better than being in the Senate, I would say, where you have colleagues, but you really end up not liking many of them at all. So.
Is that still one of the things that you would have liked most, do you think, to be a senator?
No, not anymore. If I'd been one 30 years ago, yeah, there was still some point to it. Now the Senate has no power to speak of. Or it has powers of a sort that don't interest me. It's like the power to funnel money from the federal government to your friends. This is not my idea of a noble activity. No, it's much better telling stories and being a flickering image on a screen. It has a sort of ghostly afterlife to it, which is intriguing.
Good luck, Monty.
Less theatrical. Still like
Good
big.
luck.
Good luck. Good luck.
Anybody in my generation was brought up on the talking film, which came in when I was about 4 years old. So
it's good luck.
I was 14 years old in the year of Gone with the Wind, The Wizard of Oz. The great classic films were made as I was growing up, and I saw them. So we were all riveted by films, my generation. It's no accident. Norman Mailer, William Burroughs, Truman Capote, all of my contemporaries have acted in movies. Not very well, most of them.
Good luck, Monty.
That was so perfect.
Movies are now the lingua franca of the world, or were,
Scary.
until television.
Mary Hartman! Mary Hartman!
Well, we were doing Mary Hartman and received a letter from Gore. We hadn't been on the air very long, about 2 months, I guess. But in the case of Mary Hartman, 2 months was a little different than the average weekly show. It had really caught America by storm because it was on Monday through Friday, every night of the week. Gore, I guess, had heard about it. Somebody sent him some tapes. And next we got a letter. He was coming to the States anyway, and could he guest on the show? Could we find some way to write him in? And of course we did. I believe we wrote him in when Mary Hartman was about to, or had just had, a nervous breakdown, was about to be institutionalized. And Gore was covering the story ostensibly for some major national publication. And he came on as himself. And nothing was the same.
So you really want to write a book with me about you?
Yeah, no, I mean, I really want to write a book about me, by me, about you.
Oh, by you, about me?
Yes.
You see, that is what I thought.
Yes.
See, sometimes they try to trick you around here.
I can certainly see that.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, as I told you on the telephone from Rome, I think that a book about you would be a book about America.
could be a book about emptiness, a book about promises unkept. It would also be, paradoxically, a book about hope. It would be a book about, well, survival against pretty terrible odds.
I would love to read that book.
I think Gore Vidal has his own place because he's so much a part of the popular culture. He's so welcome as a literary entertainer on the average talk show, and at the same time, he's more and more welcome in literary circles. I mean, of great esteem. I mean, Gore, to hear Gore talk, you know, the intellectual part of American literary life has not found him. To watch his amazing career is to understand that he's very well received. But he's like few other writers, like nobody else I can think of. 360 degrees of the culture seems to find interest in Gore Vidal.
There's Gore Vidal, the American writer. Let's ask him for an interview.
Good evening, Mr. Vidal. Do you mind if we disturb you for a second?
Well, I suppose you're going to ask me that inevitable question, why do I live in Rome? You could say I live here because it's so central, centrale. But most of all, I like the Romans. They don't care if you live or die. They're like cats. And of course, this is...
What do you think your most successful enterprise in the movies has been?
Well, the only time that I ever got something of my own made in my own way until the recent Billy the Kid with Val Kilmer was The Best Man, which was a play of mine that ran for 2 years on Broadway, opened in 1960. And it's a very good movie about American politics with Henry Fonda, Lee Tracy, Cliff Robertson. And it was one of the few realistic satiric plays about American politics.
Why? Bill, isn't easy to say, but I came here to support Cantwell for president.
I knew that this morning.
Did you now?
I have some gift for politics.
Well, I never said you didn't.
Tonight you warned me about Cantwell's smear, so that means you've changed your mind about him, doesn't it?
Yes, I have changed my mind about him. He lost me because he wasn't smart. He made a mistake. He figured I was going to back you when I wasn't. You got my message. Joe didn't. That's a serious error. Shows he doesn't understand character. And then, this smear thing. He fires off a cannon to kill a bug, and that is just plain dumb. So, I mean to knock him off. Which means, I guess, that you are going to be our next president.
I suppose, having been born at West Point, whose motto is duty, honor, country, that some of it must have rubbed off on me, because I noticed recurring themes, and particularly my dramatic work, is honor and justice, duty, how to behave when the enemy comes, what is honor.
You would have gone?
It ain't what I want, it's what I have to do. I guess you've gone and forgotten all the big talk. How we was all going to die for liberty, all the rest of it. Don't you remember, Father, all the speeches, all the talk, what you said right here in this room? It's our honor that's at stake. You remember?
I didn't know.
No, nobody knew, but that don't make any difference. Now there are no more speeches. There's nothing left but dying. Well, we still know how to do that. We got a real calling for that.
And do you side with those who compromised or with the idealists, however mistaken?
I think people are what they are. I don't sit in moral judgment on them.
But you like the idea of putting them into a moral situation where they had to choose?
Oh, yes. A collision of this sort is, it involves life and death, and what is honor, what is national honor, what is personal honor.
Sir, let me go with you. I could protect you.
Does the Billy the Kid character, who figures in several incarnations in your work, is he that same sort of morally ambiguous creature?
He's more the great god Pan, I think.
How can I take this? This is my present to you.
Mr. Tunstall, you give me everything I own. I don't want nothing to happen to you.
He's sort of Huckleberry Finn, the noble savage, the beauty of the wilderness, to escape civilization. As Mark Twain has Huck Finn said, to light out for the territory. Well, Billy, born in New York, lights out for the territory and creates himself. He was somebody who, again, believed in a personal honor, also didn't much care for civilization. And he thought, if you kill my friend, I will kill you.
Benvenuti.
Per me sceneggiatura è tutto, ma abbiamo qui uno proprio autore, scritto, diritto, regista e attore.
Non se ne accorge, resta lì ferma e dopo un po' muore. Anche da noi si procede pian piano e non lo...
It's remarkable what happened because you saw a real American tragedy unfold. I talked to him later about it and he said, well, you know, my grandfather had lost his Senate seat around this time of year at my age, the age I am now. And I felt his soul in me as I was doing this. It had entered into a whole other realm where he was sitting there talking with his grandfather's voice coming out of him.
I think the entire Congress is quite aware of the National Security Council and its powers and its functions and the fact that this is a national security state and less of a representative one. But it's, you know the story of the frog in the pan of cold water. If you throw a frog into hot water, it'll jump around and suffer greatly and die. If you put the frog in a pan of cold water, and you put that on the stove, and you heat it to the boiling point, the frog doesn't stir, he doesn't feel it, he doesn't notice it. And at the end of it, he's dead. These things happen incrementally, they're gradual. Are we complicit? Yes, we are. Are we revolutionaries? How do you do it once you're here?
There are no Mr. Smiths in Washington.
He's just such an original. He's so American in that way. You know, he's really clearly such a believer in the Republic in a very idealistic way, which is such a strange thing to learn about him because you could think that he was being cynical sometimes, his way of speaking, and he's so very funny and so biting. But in fact, he so believes in the purity of the Republic, and I think after after he wasn't able to successfully run for office, that it really was devastating to him. You know, I think it's part of his family thing, and you could tell that that was a turning point in some way for him.
What would you have made of him as a president or a senator?
Well, he's just too smart to ever be elected. I mean, he speaks too smart. He's just too intellectual. I mean, he would have had to probably go to a finishing school and be redone.
Political stance.
Do I think that being gay has anything to do with my political stance? I have never said that I was anything at all. I am ecumenical. There is no difference at all between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. I'm the last one. We've all known that for a long time. I was co-chairman with Dr. Spock of the People's Party until 1972. And in 72, Senator George McGovern of South Dakota appeared as an almost irresistible liberal candidate who would get us out of the war. And suddenly I realized, what's the point to our party when we have the perfect candidate to end the war?
I believe we want and must have a president who will summon this nation to a higher standard and rekindle the American purpose. I believe you're going to express that tomorrow in the privacy of that voting booth. I believe we are going to prevail.
I think part of Gore Vidal despises politics, the demagoguery, the hypocrisy of it, but another very important side of him loves politics. If there's any professional tragedy in his life, it's the fact that he never made it to the United States Senate or to some other high office, because I think an important part of him covets and admires the life of public service and politics more than any other activity.
Which book do I like best is probably Burr. And what am I working on now? Getting elected.
I've watched him handle audiences. I've watched him deal with politicians. He does have a pragmatic quality that I think would have served him well. Obviously, he would have had to discipline his tongue and his pen a little more if he'd been in public office than he has as a writer, an intellectual.
Nice thing about having had an empire is you end up with a great many rugs. Quite extraordinary. There's more rugs, probably, in the British Isles than anywhere else. I first came here in 1939 as a schoolboy. And on the 2nd of September, I went down to Downing Street and watched Neville Chamberlain come out on his way to tell the House of Commons that war was about to begin, which it did the next day. I was staying in Bloomsbury, in Russell Square. It was very exciting. The crowd was odd. I remember this exhalation. There were only about 50 people in front of it, Downing Street, when he came out, looking very nervous. And there was no applause or anything. The crowd just went, Never heard that sound of a crowd before. It's just exhalation. Racial stereotypes are irresistible, particularly in wartime. Now, I know. I was an American soldier in the great race war against Japan. Before I left to go to the Pacific, we were given an indoctrination course on how to tell our exquisite allies, the Chinese, from our brutish enemy, the Japanese. So on a stage like this, there was a life-size cutout of a naked Chinese youth, and there was another one of a Japanese. The Chinese was tall, slim, and well-proportioned. The Japanese was bandy-legged, buck-toothed, subhuman. These details were pointed out very seriously to us by an information officer with a pointer. But the principal difference, he announced, as you can plainly see, is the pubic hair. The Japanese is thick and wiry, while the Chinese is straight and silky. I fear that I alone raised my hand to ask what sly strategies we were to use to determine friend from foe. The British still read, I think, more per capita than the Americans do. And they're also rather loyal. If they've ever liked anything by you in America, you must have one hit bestseller after the other, and if you don't have it for a couple of books, you are counted out. Very Darwinian, the Great Republic. Well, the serious novel seems to be pretty much at an end as far as the general public goes. Television is now the central fact in most lives. So I would think that the great line of literature, which really sort of started with George Eliot, I suppose, and reached a peak with Proust and Henry James, is pretty much at an end. I love it when they go on about, oh, there are no great writers today. Well, of course they're great writers. They're just no great readers.
You can't have a literature without people who read it.
And they're never cured.
Yeah, that's very true.
That is a bit of wisdom I learned 40 years ago on television. When you think it's really gone very boringly, and then you watch it, which I don't do anymore, but if you do watch it, it isn't that boring. Or you may have thought it was very good, and it wasn't that good either. It's television. It just goes. There's nothing to choose. On that note, either you could